our speaker. So we are joined live from Cambridge in the UK by Francesca Hanlon. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge there, and her research looks at climate change and resilience to climate-related disasters in developing countries around the world. Her work has taken her from El Salvador to Mexico, Central African Republic to South Sudan and more, and as a result of all her efforts, she founded Blue Tap, which is a social enterprise that uses 3D printing to provide household water purification in developing countries. So amazing work, and without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Francesca, and take it away.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for having me here. I'm really excited to share to you all my knowledge that I've gained over the years about climate change, about water, and about how it's really impacting people in the poorest countries in the world. So I'm British, I'm from London, but I'm studying at the University of Cambridge. I hope you understand my accent. Some of my words might be like a little bit different, but in general, I think they're pretty similar, like Canadian, American, and English. So I'll get started with the presentation, yeah?
Sounds good.
All right. Let's see. What do we got? Looking good?
You're perfect. Full screen. It's all good.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you about who I am and why I made all the decisions to become an engineer. So when I was a kid, when I was like 8, 9, 10, I really liked science and math, and I really liked fixing things. But I also really liked people. I was really social and outgoing. And when I got to choose what I was going to do at university, I knew I wanted to help people. And that was a really important thing to me. So I thought maybe, you know, who helps people? It's doctors. I didn't really like biology so much. I more preferred physics and maths. And no one had really told me when I was younger about this thing called engineering. And then I discovered it, and I realized it was exactly the thing that I could do to help people. So I went to university and I studied civil and environmental engineering because I was really interested in the environment as well. I was really like an outdoorsy person that likes hiking and surfing. And then straight after university, I worked for loads of different charities who, use engineering to help some of the poorest people in the world. So one of them was Engineers Without Borders, which is really cool. I think it was actually founded in Canada originally, but there's a UK version. And I worked with them in Mexico, and that was really good. And then afterwards, I worked with this massive charity, one of the biggest ones in the world, and they're called Doctors Without Borders. And what they do is they provide healthcare to people who, are having a bit of a difficult time, people in settings where there's not much money or if there's conflict. And that was a really great experience for me. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that experience. As a result of it, I realized that, from firsthand, I was talking to people in Africa who were saying climate change is having such a big impact on our lives. And I thought I really wanted to do something to help. So I decided to do some research and through a PhD to understand what the problems were and how we could help people who are really feeling the effects of climate change right now today. So then I came to Cambridge to do my PhD, and I'm nearly finished with that. So what I'm going to do is talk to you a bit about that whole journey and some of the things that I found out. So first of all, why engineering? Now, hopefully listening right now, there are some young girls in the class thinking, I want to be an engineer, because I don't know if you know, but it's typically pretty male dominated. That means there's just more men and more boys studying engineering than there are girls. And girls are pretty good at engineering. When I was at university, there were 125 students, and I think only 20 were women. So I really want other young girls to be interested in engineering. It's a super good topic because you get to go out into the environment or out into the field, and you get to actually use your brain and your skills to help people. So that was really my motivation. And it was really fun. I liked maths and I liked science. And, I was in school every day and I was learning all this maths, and I kept putting my hand up and saying, okay, so I've worked out how to do this equation, but what's the point? What can I use it for? And all of my math teachers said, you sound like an engineer. So that's what I went to do. So engineer is really good to contribute to this thing called sustainable development. And I spent quite a long time studying sustainable development. And the way that I summarize it is it's like we want the whole world to grow equally. We want people to have a similar amount of wealth, but we don't want people just to have wealth without having, human rights as well. We want everyone, regardless of religion or race or sexual orientation, to have human rights. But while we develop in that way, we also want to protect our planet, because if we don't think about the planet, then it's not going to be there for our children and the next generation and the people in the year 2100. So that's kind of how sustainable development is summarized. And it's become a really important topic. And what the United Nations has done, which is this like massive organization that covers lots of countries, that kind of sets the rules about how we want to develop. So they've founded the Sustainable Development Goals. When I was about 21, I had my engineering skills. I knew I wanted to contribute to society. And I thought, okay, I can't focus on all 17 of these goals because I'm going to be super busy if I do. What's the one that I really care about? And I looked at goal 6, clean water and sanitation. And I thought, that's really important. And actually, I know this sounds a bit silly, but a big part of it was I'm really into surfing. And I thought, water's so important to me for my enjoyment, for my health. And I wanted everyone to appreciate it and to be able to appreciate it in the way that I did. So I put a real big focus on making sure that, my work was towards getting people clean water and sanitation. I did some research and I thought, what are the problems that come up? And what I discovered was it's just such a huge problem. So there's 2.4 billion people who don't have access to just a normal toilet. There's about the same number of people in the world who can't go, in their house, in their kitchen, they can't just turn on their tap and drink their water, because if they drank it, it would probably be dirty and then it would make them sick. And that's so big, because I think, there's something like above 7 billion people in the world. So such a huge number of people who have this problem. And us here in the UK and in Canada and in the US, we don't have this issue. So it's really hard to understand sometimes. And I was always thinking, isn't it crazy that we can put scientists into space and we've got artificial intelligence and all this really high-tech technology, but we can't, provide the world with just clean water and good sanitation. And I really thought, this is what I want to dedicate my life towards, working to. So I looked around and I thought, what organizations are working towards this goal? And I found one called MSF, if you're French, so Médecins Sans Frontières, so a little bit of a French lesson we'll squeeze in there. But in the US and the UK, it's called Doctors Without Borders. And they are incredible. What they do is they set up hospitals for anyone who's in a country that has had trouble. So if it's a country where, for example, there's a natural disaster or a conflict, or it's just very, very poor, Doctors Without Borders will go in and provide free healthcare for people. And this is really cool. But you remember I said I'm an engineer and I'm not a doctor. So I called up Doctors Without Borders and I said, look, I'm not a doctor, I'm an engineer, but I really want to help. And what they said to me, they said, the most people that work for this charity, they're not doctors. If you have a team of 20 people, normally just one of them is a doctor, because to be able to get a doctor to see his patients, there's all these other things that are needed around it. You need the nurses there, and then you need some engineers to be able to provide the hospital with water, or you need some engineers to be able to fix the cars to drive the doctors to the patients. So I suddenly understood that it was actually quite a big, complex challenge to get doctors to treat patients in these kind of countries that are struggling a bit. So some of the countries where MSF work, I mean, it's huge. This charity is working all over the world. And you can see in this picture here, you see all of the countries where they're working. And a lot of them is in Africa. So Africa is a really big continent. It's massive. And it's a continent where there's a lot of poverty still. So lots of people are still living on very, very little amounts of money. And often, things like the train and the water, stuff that we just think we take for granted. We see it's part of, our everyday life. They don't have that in a lot of the countries. So Doctors Without Borders works a lot there. And I went to work for them in a country called South Sudan, which, even most adults, to be honest, have never heard of. It's so, so remote and so unknown. And then I went to work for them in a country called Central Africa Republic, which is even more remote and even more unknown. So it was these really great opportunities to see countries that, you wouldn't normally get to see. So where Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, does their work is they deal with health outbreaks. So, for example, say there's a massive outbreak. There was a disease called Ebola in 2014 that occurred in West Africa. The doctors there at Doctors Without Borders, they went to treat the patients because, they needed a lot of help. It happened very quickly. Sometimes where there's war, Doctors Without Borders will go and treat some patients and treat people, especially with lots of, in Africa, there's a big population of children under 5. So lots of women giving birth. And MSF helps them to give birth in a safe way. And then you see more and more recently natural disasters. So we've seen in the last few years loads of typhoons, loads of hurricanes, loads of cyclones. And on that point, I actually had to look the other day, what is the difference between a typhoon, a hurricane, and a cyclone? And it turns out they're all exactly the same thing. It's just they've got a different name depending on where in the world they exist. So it's called a hurricane, which is, a big storm with lots of rain and wind, if it's in sort of America and the Caribbean. It's called a cyclone if it's in the sort of Africa area. And it's called a typhoon if it's in Asia. But it's all the same thing. It's a big storm that comes in, lots of rain, lots of really strong wind, and it can really damage the infrastructure and the buildings and cause some flooding. So these are the kind of situations that MSF work in. So I went to work in South Sudan. And South Sudan, I think, depending on what scale you look at it, is actually the world's poorest country. So it means the people living in South Sudan have the least money out of any country in the world. And it's also the world's youngest country. So that doesn't mean that everyone's like under the age of 5, even though a lot of people are. It means that it's the newest country to be formed. So it was originally part of Sudan, which if you look at the map, that was the country above it. But in 2011, they had an independence vote and the country wanted to be independent. So they got their independence in 2011, and there was a lot of hope that the country would be able to prosper. But then there was a new war that started because there was some conflict between, people that didn't agree. So what this meant was that you had a lot of populations that really needed healthcare and they couldn't get it. And so Doctors Without Borders was working there. So in 2015, I had my, suitcase in my bag, and I went for a year to work in South Sudan. And I had no idea what to expect. And my job was to provide the hospitals and the people in the communities where we were working with good, clean drinking water. So this picture here that you see, this is actually a water point, and this is the local community. And what's different about some poor countries in Africa and places like Canada and the US is, we all have water in our homes. We all have a tap that goes to our house, and we don't even think about it when we run a bath or have a shower, flush the toilet, drink the water. But in South Sudan, no one really has that. So they have to all share the water. And here, this is what's called a public water point. So people come with their cans and they pick up water. And one of my jobs was to build the water point. So what's really interesting is, for us, it's the government or, a private organization that provides us with water. And because our countries have so much money, we can do this in a really high-tech way. And we're really certain that the water's clean and that it can get to wherever we need it. And then it comes out at fast speed. But in South Sudan, that's not the case. And actually in this village that I was working, they didn't have any water provided. So we had to drill a big hole under the ground, get to the groundwater. So that's where the water's underneath the ground. It was about 80 meters deep. And that's really good, clean water that's down there. And then you can put in a pump and you pump it up and you can get water for the rural community. So that's a little bit of engineering there. That's quite interesting because you have to know where the water is underground, know how to drill a hole to try and get it, and then know how to pump it up. So it's really pretty fun. So that was mainly what my job was there. So I talked about engineering, and what I liked so much about working in Africa compared to working in the UK is the engineering is a little bit different. And I coined this term called Maverick Engineering because in the UK and the US and Canada, there's lots of rules and laws and lots of people who have done the engineering jobs before. So you follow guidelines. And this is really important because it means that buildings or infrastructure is made to a really good quality. But when you work in, say, an emergency situation where things have to be really quick, you often don't have the resources or the guidelines there. So you have to really use your instincts as an engineer and your knowledge. And this is really, really fun because you get to find solutions. So if you look at these pictures here, can you see the baby there in the bucket? So we didn't have scales in South Sudan because there's not many things there. So the way that we would weigh the babies is we put them in the bucket, and then on the other side we'd put something that we knew the weight of, and then we'd work out how much the baby would weigh. So that was a really fun engineering challenge, and I loved it because you had to be really imaginative with how you solved problems. And then you see on the right here, so that tent there, that's actually a hospital inside that. So that's where you treat patients. But obviously, you know, there's so little resources, and you have to build things really, really quickly with not much money. So it's really quite fun and exciting. And that's the type of engineering you do in international development. So after about a year of this experience, living and working in South Sudan, I was talking to people all the time. I was trying to find out what their lives were like, because it's so different from what ours is like in the Western world. And most people there only eat one food. I mean, it's amazing because if you think about all the foods you eat in a day, I ate cheese, chocolate, meat, all these things today. There, they only have one crop called sorghum, which is actually not very nice. I couldn't eat it every day, but they don't have any opportunity to get all these different foods that we have. And this crop is really, really reliant on the weather. So it needs rain at a certain time of year, and it needs, some dry period at a certain time of year to grow. And I started to speak to people about their lives. And what I kept hearing was people saying again and again, you know, the weather's really changed in the last 5 or 10 years. And I thought this was so interesting because I'd been to school and to university, and I'd heard all of these stories about climate change, and lots of people saying, does it exist? Doesn't exist? We don't know. And the people in this region, they'd never heard of the term climate change. You know, lots of these people didn't get to go to school at all because they lived in a refugee camp. But people were describing to me exactly the effects of climate change. And I thought it was so interesting. It was such a good bit of information because you knew they weren't biased. They weren't saying it for any political reason because they didn't know about the politics. So what they were saying is, you know, for hundreds and hundreds of years, the rainy season in Africa, which is when the rain falls quite regularly, every day, was between April and October. And this was really good because in April to October, all the crops would grow and people could farm them, so they'd have food to eat. And, they'd be healthy. They could eat food, they could sell the food. It was a really good thing. And then they had the dry season, which was October to April, you know, over our Northern Hemisphere winter. And that worked. And then the people who were 25, 26, they were saying to me, you know, these last 5-6 years, the weather's completely changed and we don't understand why. And what's happening now is the rain's only falling in August, and it's falling really, really hard. And we have so much rain that it completely floods. And then it's not there for the rest of the time. So the crops aren't used to this, and the crops die or they just don't grow. And it's really affecting people. And actually, that's been so bad that the United Nations, that big organization that sets the Sustainable Development Goals, they said, actually, there's a famine now in South Sudan because of this. So it's a really big problem. This picture here, actually, that you see on the screen with these women, they're carrying sticks to build their homes. This is actually the airstrip that the planes for Doctors Without Borders would take us to projects. So if you imagine your airstrip in your airport, if you've been on a plane, you know, it's nice, big concrete, really smooth. Landing on this airstrip was much scarier, I have to say, sometimes. So this photo, this is what it's like when it flooded. So the planes couldn't land, but also it's quite bad because, you know, flooding's not only bad because it destroys things, it's also really dangerous because you've got quite a lot of dirty water there. So I discovered this problem and I spoke to people and I just thought, this is huge and I really want to do something to contribute to try and make it better. And I looked into it and I saw that people were saying that the predominant means main, basically. The main impacts of climate change on humans and the environment occur through water. So it's almost like, in my eyes, you can't talk about the impacts of climate change without really talking about how we interact with water and how people in developing countries also interact with water. So some of these things that happen is, for example, you get lots of refugees. So a refugee is someone who has to leave their country. And they have to leave their country because either there's a war, there's sort of politics, or what we're seeing more and more is people leaving their country because of these really extreme weather events from climate change. And these extreme weather events are these big storms that I mentioned, hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones, which are all the same thing. And you see that in recent years, the 10 biggest reasons that people have had to leave their homes is actually because of these climate change events. So in India, there were some floods. In Indonesia, there were some floods. In China, typhoons again. So it's a really big problem. And what's really interesting about it, right, is it's actually the people who live in the poorer countries that are more likely to be affected by a disaster or by climate change. And the reasons for that are quite a few. So one of them is these extreme weather events. You're seeing them in locations in the world that are closer to the equator. So that's like really, the center line of the world. And in these places, it's just, slightly hotter climates. And so you're more likely to have these extreme strong events. Like in England, we have a really normal temperate climate. So we don't see cyclones, hurricanes, or typhoons. But also it's because in developing countries, the buildings and the roads and the infrastructure is less good at protecting the populations. So if you look at, you had a big hurricane. You remember Hurricane Sandy in the United States. Well, not many people died. But then you had a similar event in Myanmar, which is a country just next to India, which is quite poor. And lots of people died because of, there was less infrastructure to protect the populations. So I really wanted to work on, helping these people that were a bit more vulnerable. So again, United Nations, we always go back to this big organization because they really set the rules and they set like the vision for how we're going to change the world to help us adapt to this changing climate. And they said there's lots of options, but one of the options they looked at that I really liked is how about we try and enable people to stay in their homes? So if there's lots of people who are becoming refugees, and no one in the world wants to become a refugee, then one way to stop that is to help them to be able to stay in their homes. And with climate change, this is kind of known as adapting to climate change. So we kind of have an idea how the climate is changing. We know there's these more extreme weather events, the droughts are longer and the floods are more intense. So what is the way that we can help people to manage this? That was really the question that I started to look at. So one way is rainwater harvesting. Now, I spend my life talking about how good rainwater harvesting is because I think it's amazing. And what I love about it most is it's really, really, really simple. So rainwater harvesting is when you catch rain on your roof and it goes into a gutter or like a pipe, and then it goes down into a cistern. A cistern is just a fancy name for a tank that you store. And then you can use a pump to pump it to your house, and you can use it to flush the toilet, to have a shower. Even if you put chlorine in it, so that a little bit of chlorine so that you can drink it, then it becomes drinking water. And what's so good about rainwater harvesting is it's pretty cheap. It's not expensive to do. And we've got rainwater pretty much everywhere. And rainwater is really pretty clean, surprisingly. It's much cleaner than water you see on the surface of the ground. And in some countries that are very poor, people drink that surface water and then they get sick. So rainwater harvesting is a much better way to adapt to climate change. So this is what it looks like. And this is a picture of a tank in a country called Uganda, which is quite close to South Sudan. So it's in Africa again. But in Uganda, there's no war, so it's quite stable. And, it is still quite poor, but people have a slightly better quality of life than in South Sudan. So this here, this is in action. You've got this roof, and then the pipe goes towards the tank, and then you've got the water in the tank. So what's really good about this is what I mentioned before is if you've got a rainy season, for quite a long time, and then you've got a dry season, you want to make sure that in the rainy season there's not too much water so that's flooding your garden or flooding your house, and in the dry season you've got enough water to wash your dishes and have a shower. So when the rain falls on the house, some of it, or quite a lot of it, goes into the tank, so that prevents some of the rain from going into the grounds and the garden and flooding the garden. So that's really good. But then if you store a lot of water and it's clean, which it is if you build the tank right, then families have water for the dry season. So then they don't have the drought, and then they're more resilient to climate change. So for me, this is like a really, really, really good technique to look into and to talk to people about. So I mentioned this word resilience, which might be a bit complicated. But resilience basically means that people have the ability to be able to prepare for something that might be unpredictable, something that's a bit new. And the thing about climate change is it's just creating these new weather patterns that are quite a shock to people and to the crops. And being resilient means that you can really be prepared for this kind of new weather pattern. So I sum this up in a term called water security. So being water secure means that you have enough water, just like we do here. We always have enough water. We don't even think about it. You've got it all year round. So you don't just have water in the rainy season. You've got water in the dry season, and that your water is a really good quality. And if you have these three things, then you're water secure. So the question of water security, places like the US, Canada, and the UK, it's not even a question because we'll always have this. Some parts of the US actually have a bit of drought, but mainly we've got this well. And in the poorer countries in Africa, they often don't have this. So really what I believe is through rainwater harvesting, we can help people work towards this. And then just a little bit of a last thing. So PhD research, it's funny because you should never ask anyone what their PhD is about because they'll give you a really long wordy answer. But PhD research in general is about contributing to the world's knowledge about topics. And that's really, really important. But for me, I think what's really important is taking action on the research. If you can take action to, take everything that you've learned and use it to help the world so that the world is equally a better place, then that's really important. So what I did is I put together a group and we built a charity called Blue Tap that does all of the things that I've spoken to you about here. So we really encourage populations in low-income countries, in developing countries, populations that are a bit vulnerable, to make sure that they're water secure. And we fund rainwater harvesting projects, and we build some really cool technologies to clean the water. And that's a really fun part of applying the research to real-world situations.